Hello, my name is Benji and welcome to Dice vs Cards. Today we unveil a new series where I do my level best to educate you in the ways of tabletop miniature games. Whilst this particular hobby goes by many different aliases, the common denominator will almost always be the inclusion of scale miniatures and a means to measure range between them. Most but not all of the time you'll also be chucking loads and loads of dice. Today's showpiece is Warhammer, Age of Sigmar. So buckle up and get comfortable, because for the next 4 weekly videos we're going to be finding out if this is the right game system for you, how to get into it, some background lore and a little bit of trivia. In Age of Sigmar you command a merry band of models representing the 4 differing factions of order, chaos, death and destruction, all in approximate 28mm scale and accompanying 6-sided dice. Having replaced its predecessor Warhammer Fantasy Battle in 2015, Sigmar was born out of a conscious decision to make a more accessible, large-scale miniature war game, where rules are condensed to just a few pages, with the depth of the game then devolved in large part to the abilities of the units you control and to the missions and campaigns that you can take part in, enhancing the narrative elements wherever possible. Age of Sigmar is themed in a pseudo-fantasy setting, retaining a great number of swords and sorcery type units, but combining them with elements of steampunk and other postmodern fantasy archetypes. With battles taking place over 8 interconnected realms, each with their own habitat and ecosystem. We'll of course be covering the lore and setting of the game in more detail during the remainder of the series. The game's mechanics follow a fairly conventional model, which we'll come on to, but there are 3 core ways within which you can play. The first is open play, where only card carrying cool cats need apply. Basically, there are no rules on who brings what, you just place your minis on the table and go at it. The second way to age your Sigmar is narrative play, where you guessed it, deployment, army size and quite often army composition are all dictated by the mission briefing and aim to weave a story of a battle fought long ago. The final and most popular option is matched play, where you both agree on a mission, its associated objectives and a number of points that you can use to build your army, with each model and unit in your chosen faction having its own points value and the only restriction being your imagination and actual possession of the miniatures. So we're set up done and dusted, and you staring across the more often than not 6-foot by 4-foot battlefield at your opponent. Each player turn, as I've already mentioned, follows a fairly conventional route, starting with a warlord phase where players will inspire their troops using command abilities, and your wizards and priests will be slinging spells and healing allies as well. The success of most of these will be dependent on the roll of a dice needing equal to or greater than a target number. You then transition to moving your units, one at a time, using a measuring device of your choice calibrated to count inches from point A to point B. That's right, everything in Sigmar is measured in inches because, well, you know. Each unit will then have a movement characteristic that will dictate how far they can move, but they can also forego the remainder of their turn by choosing to run and adding d6 inches to their total movement. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, this was all just a preamble to the good ship Lollipop, because the carnage commences next with the shooting phase. Not all units will have range capabilities, but those that do get to do their thing here. Factoring in the maximum range of their weapons, they then need to roll at least a target number to hit the opponent's unit, and then if that's a success, do similar to determine whether a successful hit is sufficient to wound. As you'd expect, different units and different weapons offer different proficiencies and likelihoods of success in their attempts. But alas, the targeted unit does get one chance to avoid casualties in the form of armour saves. Another target number test that needs to be rolled for each wound to be ignored. But that may also be modified depending on what weapon was shot. Any fails result in either damage being applied to your models, or if they sustain enough damage, removal from the game. The next 2 phases though represent the true bloodthirstiness of battle. Firstly, you're going to be charging your opponents by rolling 2d6 inches to a target unit. If you can move to within distance, then come the next phase, swords will be drawn and blood will be shed. If you don't, you stand still and pretend that your crap dice roll didn't just happen. So up to this point it's been you and you alone doing their thing, But during the fight phase, you're going to be taking turns with your opponent, picking a unit that's in melee combat and swinging for the fences. Melee combat acts much like range combat in that you roll to hit, roll to wound, and then your opponent gets to try and stop those wounds being applied. The main difference being that any surviving models are going to be on the angry side of angry and will of course get to practice sweet revenge later on during the phase. Then once all units have engaged in melee combat, we tidy up the player turn with one more phase. That phase is the battle shock phase, one where the mettle of even the most courageous units is tested. The principle being that the more models in a unit that you lost during that turn will result in a greater likelihood that more, if not the whole unit, will flee the battlefield. This will be mitigated somewhat by your unit's bravery, but the higher you roll a d6, the more chance that cowards will be cowards and your unit will sustain further losses. So that's the game in a nutshell. Why would or wouldn't you choose this game system over the hundreds of other choices on the market? Number 1. You want the feel of a large scale miniature war game, but you don't want rules bloat. Then Age of Sigmar was designed for you. Yes, it's true that you still need to do a lot of referring to each unit's war scrolls that detail their characteristics and abilities, but it's still a comparatively easy game to learn than some of its contemporaries. Number 2. You want stunning miniatures and you're not too bothered that they aren't all of the traditional fantasy mould, then you'll be well catered for here. Games Workshop are at the tippy top of the mountain when it comes to miniature design and quality. And with all the different factions from humans and elves to orcs and the undead, plus many more, there's sure to be an aesthetic here that will be your cup of tea. Number 3 is the flip side to that upside, and that's cost, which is very much a mixed bag. All of the core sets and start collecting sets, which we'll cover in the remaining videos in this series, are, I would say, reasonably priced for what you're getting. When you look to expand your armies, however, some of the costs are definitely towards the high end. It's obviously up to you whether you think they're good value, but no one is going to come forward and proclaim that this is a cheap game system to get your hooks into, especially with some of the accessories you'll need to buy along with it. Number 4. You want a game that focuses in large part on melee combat. Yes, there's plenty of spellcasting and range shenanigans during a game of Sigmar, but a good portion of the games will devolve into a melee slugfest, and the revolving nature of player turns during hand-to-hand combat provides the most engaging and some of the most tactical action you'll undertake throughout. Number 5. You really want the narrative of each battle to be front and centre. Yes, you can just put your models down on the table and have at it, letting the last player standing take home the spoils, but there's an almost endless number of ways you can play missions and campaigns, each with differing objectives, scalable sizes of battle that can result in games lasting anywhere from a couple of hours to a whole afternoon, army compositions that give you associated buffs, and so on and so forth. This is a highly customizable gameplay experience that really rewards you going headfirst into the game and swimming in all of the possibilities it provides. So there you have it, the ups, downs, lefts and rights of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. A large scale miniature war game with a gigantic product line, many different ways to play, and a world famous company in Games Workshop behind the wheel. But does this seem like the miniature tabletop game for you? Please let me know in the comments, and remember to come back next week with the second video in our series. However, that's it from me. I'll see you next time.